Good evening, everyone. My name is Donald. I'm very pleased and privileged to be the chair for this evening's public lecture by Professor Robert Klitgaard, who's going to speak to us on the subject of public-private partnerships, combining leadership, entrepreneurship, and service. And for those of you who are regular visitors to the LKY school, you know, or you might know that Bob is really a longtime friend of the school. Until recently, until 2009, he served as the president of the Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. And prior to that, he had served as the dean of the Pardee Rand Graduate School, which I understand is part of the Rand Institute, where he was also the fourth distinguished professor of international development and security. Bob, as I found out yesterday night, has had a fascinating career. He's been to do research and other consultancy work in over 30 countries, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. He's well known as one of the world's leading experts on corruption. That was how the Christian Science Monitor described him. And as I found out in Urdu yesterday, besides speaking fluent French and Portuguese, he also speaks rusty Urdu. And when he had an incredibly full dinner yesterday, and at the end of the evening he said, what's the Urdu word for full? And it was hatam.
Hatam.
You're under no doubt that you're very full when right. Somebody in Urdu says hatam. Right? So with that not too particularly relevant introduction to Bob, can we join me in inviting Bob to deliver his lecture?
Okay,
thank you,
thanks,
Bob.
Donald. Thank you. Believe me, if you go eating with Donald, khatam is the right word, because one course, two courses, I stopped counting after a while. Well, thank you for coming out after hours to hear this talk. What we thought we'd do today is spend about a half an hour talking with you about some of the issues with public-private partnerships, giving you some feeling for the trends that are going on, giving you some examples, and then raising some issues at the end for discussion. So don't be shy at the end. I'll start with one example that I find particularly interesting and inspiring, even though at the end it has a cautionary tale about the difficulty of leading and managing public-private nonprofit partnerships. Then I'll talk about ways to think about the comparative advantages of the different sectors: private, for-profit, government, not-for-profit. And then talk about what these partnerships, what arranging and leading and managing these partnerships, what the challenges are in terms of how you do that. And I indirectly have the feeling that our business schools and our public policy schools are not doing a good enough job of training the future leaders and managers of partnerships. Finally, we'll look at what some of the challenges are for universities like the National University of Singapore, and by extension for some government agencies. And then we'll have time for your questions and comments. So let's start off with an example. This is San Antonio, Texas, a city in central Texas. Those of you who are basketball fans know that the NBA champs are the San Antonio Spurs. The challenge is the dropout from high school of Latino students of Mexican ancestry or from Central America, who drop out at an alarming rate. Indeed, at the time this case study is started, they're dropping out at 48% do not finish high school, compared with much lower numbers for other ethnic groups. There is a small pilot study that's gone on in San Antonio. In fact, if I ask, what would you ask a typical school superintendent, what would you do about that problem? They'd say, spend more money, more of the same, more testing, crank it up. But this crazy idea, they had a small pilot study done by an NGO, had this crazy idea that no school ever would have thought of. You know what we're going to do? We're going to take Latino students when they're in junior high school, the ones who are most at risk, and have them tutor first and second graders in basic reading and math. Now imagine trying to sell that to parents in the school. Your student, your child, is going to have some junior high school flunky come over and tutor her. You say, I don't want some juvenile delinquent coming into my home. What about teachers? They're going to say, when am I going to do this? You want me to stop my classes and bring this kid in? What about money? How do you pay for this? How do you design it and manage it? Who's going to lead it? And you can imagine that the obstacles to making this small pilot study into something real are significant. So to make the model work, you'd need a lot of things. You'd need some startup money. You'd need some political capital and organizing ability. You'd need buy-in from school officials, teachers, parents, and so forth. And in many places, the ideas never get started. So an interesting question for us about this thing is, how did they do this? How did they make it happen? They created something called the Coca-Cola Valued Youth Project. If you look online, there are some fabulous videos about this. Basically, Coca-Cola comes along and says, we want to do something good for the community, and we'd like to focus some charitable resources on Latino dropouts. And so they go see Mayor Henry Cisneros, who was mentioned at this time as a possible vice presidential candidate. So he's a big educator, pro-education person. He says, you know what, I'd like you to meet the guy who runs this nonprofit that did the experiment with the tutors. And so they meet, and they begin the idea of a public-private nonprofit partnership, which has distinctive advantages for each partner. And I want you to notice the distinctive roles that each partner is going to play to make this work. Let's start with the mayor. What are the advantages of a mayor? What can the mayor do? Sets policies. He can provide leadership, meaning, in this case, what? What could he do? He has some money maybe, but what can he do to provide leadership on this? He's authorized to make decisions. How about if he invites you to breakfast to talk about this? Would you come? Yeah. So mayors have the possibility of convening people. When they say, please come along, you're a business leader, you're a parent, the mayor calls you in, if you're going to listen. So there is political cover for this idea. There's an authorizing environment, which means creating a situation where it's legitimate to do this. There is the ability to have some money that he might control, but in general, mayors in America don't control the education system. It's independent from mayoral control. So that's the mayor. Thank you very much. Coca-Cola, what's its advantage in a problem like this? In general, what's the private sector advantage in something like education for junior high school students? Consumers. They have delicious, nutritious, good for you, good for them. No, I'm not talking about that. That's a good point. And they might want the Coke machine in the school, right? We're not going to let them do that. What do private sector people have to offer to public-private nonprofit partnerships? Money. Start with money, right? What else? Publicity, marketing. They're good at that, aren't they? Private sector tends to be better at that than public sector. What else are they good at? Transparency? Interesting. Okay, maybe. Yeah. They can move quickly, right? They're not so bureaucratic. They might be better at IT, information technology. They may be better at management training in certain technical areas. They may have some technical skills that government agencies don't have. Financial management, project design. So Coca-Cola provides seed money, has some other advantages that it can bring to the table. What about parents? What's their role in a problem like this? What are they good at? Feedback about what's going on. They can give you feedback because their students tell them, right? Let me give you a hint. There's the supply side of this problem and there's the demand side. So if the parents aren't on board, what's going to happen? Kids aren't going to go to this program. It's never going to get started. So to mobilize demand for a program like this, parents are essential. And then there's two other partners too. The schools themselves, which are here, they provide facilities. And they have their own authorizing environment because they have to say this is legitimate educationally. And then finally, there's the nonprofit that invented this idea. It's called the IDRA. And they know a lot about how to design the syllabus, how to create tutor training, and how to evaluate this result. So you can see these are distinctive competences, aren't they? To make this work, somehow we have to put all this together. And they formed an effective partnership, and it worked. The dropout rate in a comparison study right next door to them, they had less than 2% of participating students dropped out, and then also huge increases in achievement, attitude, and so forth. So an unqualified success. And indeed, the innovation spread. Coca-Cola took this, interestingly, to Brazil. And online, if you want to look this up, Coca-Cola Valued Youth Program in Brazil, you'll hear exuberant Brazilian Portuguese lauding, and students lauding the value of this program and how dropout rates went down by about a factor of 3. And then finally in Atlanta, which is the home of Coca-Cola, the program spread there too. Good news. And yet, the idea didn't take off. When Coca-Cola wasn't pushing it, it didn't spread, even though it worked. Here, for example, is a graph of Bexar County, Texas, which is where San Antonio is located. Look at Latino dropout rates. Do you see progress? Do you see anything like 2, 3, 4, 5%? Way, way higher. 48 down to 42, which isn't much. Other tutor programs have the same problem. Here's one that is called Check and Connect, which worked. And it cost $1,300 US and had 2 days of training and couldn't catch fire. Nobody wanted it when it worked. So the question I want to raise to you is this: why doesn't something like this work? And I want to note a possibility which I think is widespread with promising public-private nonprofit collaboration. On the one hand, you can get very successful results. On the other hand, it's hard to lead and manage them. This is not a traditional skill. It's beyond the usual skill set and job description of a Coca-Cola executive, of a PTA head, of a school superintendent, indeed of a mayor. And so putting these together and making this happen is the challenge that we face when we're designing and managing public-private partnerships. So I want to raise some of the good news and bad news about this, and then leave us with some challenges for places like this university. So, second point we'd like to talk about is the comparative advantage that each kind of institution, abstracting from Coca-Cola to the private sector and from this mayor to government and so forth, what they bring to the table with regard to important social issues. So we have private firms who bring their capabilities in things that we've talked about: marketing, innovation, R&D, information technology, speed of movement, ability to hire and fire people, ability to pay big wages for high-priced talent. All those things are what private sector is pretty good at. What is it not good at? Perhaps taking the public interest as its first priority, right? Tends to focus on its own interest. It's the private sector, which means it's focused on its own bottom line. What are governments good at? Governments are good at, if they're good, are good at providing an authorizing environment, which means a legal and policy framework for action. The rules of the game. The ability to get people together to try to mobilize and explain to the public what the public good is involved in providing certain initiatives. The civil society organizations, nonprofit organizations of all kinds, are very good at knowing what the demand side looks like. If you have parents groups, they represent parents' interest, and also if they are behind the project, they can mobilize demand by parents. Similarly, farmers' associations or women's groups are able to mobilize demand around certain issues where governments and private sector can't. If the private sector goes in and says, farmers, this is really good for you, they might say, you just want us to buy your product. If the government goes in and says, farmers, this is really good for you, they might say, you just want us to vote for you. But if other farmers say, we've tried this and it works, it has more credibility. And so the demand side of the equation is often involves the mobilization of demand by civil society organizations. Then there are types of goods. There are private goods, which are goods that you consume and doesn't have any effect on anybody else. They're excludable. And there's public goods where there are goods where your consumption of it doesn't reduce the total supply available to others. Breathing clean air is a classic example, or national security. And then there are common pool resources where it might be some local meadow or a local fishery or local forest where in some sense we all have to manage this, so there may be a tendency to overfish or overcut or overgraze. And so these are types of goods, and then Robert Picciotto in an interesting paper said there are also hybrids among these three. There are toll goods, for example, which is sort of a combination between a government good and a private good. So the task is figuring out how to align the various kinds of goods that we need to make a problem happen with the various kinds of actors who could provide distinctive and powerful advantages. Take the Green Revolution, for example. We're trying to go to the second generation, which is more environmentally conscious of the secondary effects of the Green Revolution. But in the Green Revolution, you have things like research and development about seed varieties. Now, to the extent that's basic science, that's a public good. So governments fund that. To the extent it's a private good, then seed companies will fund that. Governments also provide an authorizing environment for all sorts of things. They provide extension agents, typically, for example, to help farmers learn about the latest benefits. The private sector does things like distributing seeds and agricultural supplies and often buying the products the farmers give. Sometimes they also extend credit to farmers. And the nonprofit organizations could include farmers groups who may get together to buy inputs at lower prices, or may get together to help foment change. For example, if they've seen that certain products work, they may get together and help mobilize demand for better seeds, better fertilizers, and better farming practices. And because many kinds of goods are involved here, we need many kinds of institutions to make reform work. If we just say, let's leave Green Revolution 2.0 to government itself, it won't happen as well or as effectively if we can somehow get the private sector and the civil society organizations involved. Ditto for the private sector. So the old dilemmas of should we have public provision or should we privatize are obsolete in problems where we have all these different kinds of goods involved. Somehow we need to collaborate or combine forces or create something like a partnership. Now let me give you some more examples that I find quite interesting and inspiring of successful public-private nonprofit collaboration. The first one involves the Bangalore Agenda Task Force, which was initiated, I guess the original ideas were initiated by this gentleman, Samuel Paul. Samuel was, despite his name, is an Indian from the southern part of India, member of the Syrian Christian community that goes back to about 100 AD in India. And he came back from his time at the World Bank and at Harvard, former dean of the Indian Institute of Management, and set up a nonprofit in Bangalore, India, called the Public Affairs Center. And its goal was to work with government and business to create scorecards of government performance at the ministerial level for that area. So, for example, they would hire a private company to do polling of individuals when they left the agency and say, how was your service today? Did you have to pay a bribe? How would you rate it on a 1 to 10 scale? Get those results along with objective measures. They would call up and see how long it took to get the phone answered, for example. And with elite interviews of major companies, let's say, that dealt with the electricity company or with the water company. And combining those three sources of information, they created scorecards of government performance. First, they shared that with the government ministers themselves, so there weren't any big surprises. And the government ministers were shocked at the results they heard about bad performance and corruption. But they said, we accept the methodology because we believe in this private sector firm that did the methods, the polling firm, and we believe that you as an NGO are not after us, you're apolitical. And then they went public. They went to the newspapers. What happened next were challenges to the city agencies. What reforms do you propose? What actions could you take? How can you be more transparent? The city agencies did some things, but it wasn't until a new kind of social entrepreneur showed up, the new chief minister, S.M. Krishna, who comes along and he says, you know, if we're going to make this information about performance effective in mobilizing change, we're going to set up a partnership that will involve the business sector as well. You'd probably know that Bangalore is an incipient high-tech area, the Silicon Valley of India. And so there are all the big companies down there, some of them Indian, some of them transnational, who are demanding better public services, transportation, water, power, etc. So they have a strong interest in making things better. The chief minister invites them. He convenes them. That's one of his powers. Gets them there with the heads of the agencies and with these citizen organizations and says, let's take this information and your strategies and your ability, business, especially in IT, management training and so forth, project design, let's put this together and make something amazing happen. And so it sets up a public-private citizen partnership which assists the agencies in their reforms and helps the NGOs monitor progress. So what happened? Civil society was there to push for reforms. People care about better services, especially things that are as visible as traffic, electricity, telephones, and so forth. The private sector people knew how to hire outside expertise to bring in on difficult problems, which the government couldn't do very easily. So when the government rules would not let them hire high-priced consultants, let's say, they helped with that. The private sector also convinced the government agency that its promotion and training for executives and project managers was obsolete, very much based on seniority. They said, you know what we do? We identify young talent, train it, and do it. How about if we help you do that? So they did. They helped them with IT. They helped them with key areas, key projects. And finally, they used their resources and their pressure to mobilize the activities of the public agencies. The result a few years later was rated by the government of India as a revolution in public services. And if you look at, you can find again some stuff on the web about this. You'll find some nice videos about how this worked. But in my opinion, there are three parts here where the distinctive competences of each part of each partner played a crucial role. Government brought its ability to convene and create an authorizing environment. Also, its ability, in the case of the chief minister, to insist that each agency would provide its strategic plans to the partnership for vetting and criticizing. Civil society had information that was credible and politically neutral, which was done technically excellently in a partnership with private polling firms. It also had the press there to help pressure for change by publicity. And finally, business brought its resources and its ideas to the table. And the result was high-performance government. Now, a second example is one that scares me. If you want to find an example of something that really could scare us all, it would be extreme drug-resistant tuberculosis. But let's just talk about MDR TB, multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, already considered a version of one of the three great health challenges in the world right now. If you don't treat TB correctly, or if the regimen is incomplete, people can develop a resistance to the standard recipes, the standard drugs, and they end up with something which is highly dangerous because it's contagious, but it's hard to control. And there are some very expensive cocktails of drugs that have to be given, and they have to be followed very carefully. So we need the hospitals to be safe. We need the nurses to provide the proper care. We need civil society organizations to help the slum dwellers, the people in prisons, the HIV patients who often don't want to reveal themselves as sufferers of this, to not only come forward that I have this problem, but also to comply with the treatment. There's a moving video of this where a 10-year-old girl has the MDR TB, and she's interviewed in her native language, and she says, "When they told me I needed to take medicine, I cried. But then they showed me that other people took it and got well, so I was happy." So we want to avoid just the stigma of crying, the stigma of maybe being fired from my job, the stigma of oppression by my peers, to provide a combination of various goods. Here's the prevalence of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. What 40% means of those who have tuberculosis, how many of them develop multi-drug resistant TB? So this is not how many people have MDR TB in the society, because tuberculosis is a rare disease in many countries. In 3 countries that are particularly focused on, in our problem, Russia in prisons, India, and I'll get to the other one just now. They tried to provide 3 things. First, how can we get the needed drugs in the countries? South Africa was the third. How do we get the drugs there at much lower cost, much quicker? That's the first problem. That's a production problem on the supply side. The demand side includes a correct diagnosis of MDR TB so that nurses and doctors identify it when it's there so they can treat it effectively. They don't just let it go and people go out, and also community work to mobilize demand for compliance with the treatment. And finally, with regard to XDR-TB, a big item on the agenda is how can we prevent this at all? These are ones that have no known drug to fight them. And if this takes off, that's the one that really worries people. This could take off and a lot of people could get infected. So what they did is they set up, thanks to Eli Lilly, the drug making company, they set up something called the Eli Lilly MDR-TB partnership. And it has a number of partners. Let me read a few of them to you. It has the World Health Organization. It has the regional health organizations such as PAHO. It has the Center for Disease Control in America, which did things like tracking the data and putting them all in an electronic data bank. It had an NGO called Partners in Health, which originally developed some of the treatments in Peru, and then when it worked in Russia, was involved in creating manuals for training nurses and also studying how alcoholism interacted with this problem. Médecins Sans Frontières, the famous medical association of doctors who give voluntary service on difficult problems. Pharmaceutical companies in South Africa, India, and Russia partnered with Eli Lilly to share the technology. Eli Lilly gave them the technology for free to set up factories to develop the anti-TB drugs so they could be easily dispersed locally. Purdue University, which is near the home of Eli Lilly, partnered with this whole thing, providing training and quality control for these three companies in the third world, or actually second world in the case of Russia. The health ministries in South Africa, India, and Russia had to be brought in. The NGOs on the scene in each country, particularly working in prisons or working in the slums of India. Nurses associations to understand the regimens, identification, how to get trained up about this, what superstitions there were that were false, and what dangers that are real. Doctors associations for the same thing. The Red Cross. The World Economic Forum got involved when it was recognized that, you know what, we have to get into the companies here because people are afraid to reveal it because they're afraid they're going to get fired. So if you're a company and can come forward to help people identify TB, promise them they're not going to get fired, you can then help with the treatment and cure of this problem. Otherwise, we'll have hidden carriers of this thing in your companies and could lead to negative results. So the World Economic Forum was active with a TB, Business Against TB group. So that's a lot of people. And you can see the three big things it worked on. Now, this is Patrizia Carlevaro, who is the convener of this effort on behalf of Eli Lilly. And so a couple of years ago, I interviewed her about the success of this program. And I asked her, what are the challenges you faced in designing, leading, and managing this huge partnership? It sounds very difficult. She was wonderful. She said, it has been successful, and we are proud of it. Shall I try to impersonate her Italian accent? No, I don't think I will. Unfortunately, lots of partnerships break down because of bureaucracy. People meet, and then between meetings, nothing happens. Sound familiar? People talk a lot and do very little. What skills are most needed, I asked her, to lead and manage these partnerships? She said, passion is one element. What an Italian, right? Begin here, not here. I agree with her. Passion is one element. What does she mean by passion? You have to find people in each organization, each partner, who have passion, even though they are often in silos, found in their own little places, and you've got to bring those people together. So identifying the partners who have passion for what? For the problem and the solution, not for their bureaucracy, is crucial. She said, often as soon as funds for partnerships dry up, they collapse. This was my experience at UNICEF, where she had worked before. Sorry, UNICEF, don't mean to cast any aspersion on you. So the challenge is how to get these passionate people together and keep them together. I like that. After 16 years, I'm happy. This partnership is going by itself now. It's self-sustaining. What were some of the big challenges you faced in designing and leading this organization? We learned that Lilly's supplying the drugs is not enough. Remember the movie Field of Dreams? If you build the park, they will come. How many failed programs around the world do we have where we build the water pumps and nobody uses them, or they don't maintain them? We build the roads and they don't get maintained. We do this, we do that. Nobody cares, seems to care about the maintenance and upkeep or the cofactors to make it work. The Green Revolution needs the seeds and the fertilizer and the water. The public health program needs the injections and the clean water and the education. And if we can't get those things to happen together, often things just dissipate. The system has to be ready to support them. We supplied the medicines to the WHO, but a lot of them had to be destroyed because the WHO could not absorb what we gave them. Okay? You have to facilitate the registration of drugs. A big challenge is counterfeit drugs. Also, by the way, the marketing of the drugs. So HIV, retroviral drugs that are given at very low cost to other countries, what are they going to do with them? People try to steal them and resell them on the international market. Look at this one. With so many partners, sometimes you have to say, we have consulted everyone, this is the plan, you have to fit in with the plan. At some point, discussion stops, we move forward. We don't have enough money or time to do everything with everyone. Turnover among those trained is a challenge. 6 months after they're trained, they leave. What incentives can we create, especially in work like this with contagious diseases? On the front line of police, disease, all these things that are very intensive, it's hard to keep qualified people there. It's just such a risk of burnout. Reaching out into the workplaces is a challenge. Providing information about MDR TB, avoiding stigma, having companies invest in prevention and treatment, they see it as a cost, not as an investment. And so then finally I asked her, what about for people like the ones I'm talking to tonight? What advice would you give them? To you, especially you students. Everyone is so qualified these days. When we hire, it seems like everyone has advanced degrees, even tiers of advanced degrees. People who succeed in this work are energetic, practical, even as they think outside the box. I keep asking my people, how can you make 1 + 1 = 3? They have to have commitment. This is not an 8-hour job. They have to say, I've done this, now what else can I do? And finally, she closed with this quote. Didn't get this quite right, but see if you like it. She said, I like a quote from Schopenhauer, the German philosopher. She said, I won't get it exactly right, but it goes something like this. Smart people hit a target that other people cannot hit. Geniuses hit the target that other people cannot see. She said, in development, this is precisely where we are. We need leaders who can envision the target and then hit it. And in her case, not saying she's a genius or that she thinks she is one, the target was a partnership that could take on this problem. The problem in San Antonio is not just saying, hey, I got a good idea if we have these junior high school students tutor these people. Everybody goes, that's crazy. No, but we made it work. Look at the study. Really? Okay. Then the next step is you did something we never thought of. We didn't even think of that. Now we have to get together and make something happen that's more than just a good idea. So let me give you a generalization. Addressing many social problems has two sides. Integrating supply, by which I mean things like seed, fertilizer, and water, or education, drugs, safe health conditions, and good primary care, and mobilizing demand, especially in the most impoverished and disadvantaged areas. People are distrustful. They are also, to put it nicely, ignorant. They don't understand the risks. You can see this right now with Ebola. People are blaming the doctors for bringing Ebola. They're blaming the victims for witchcraft or something else that's going on, so they refuse the kinds of treatment that we need. To mobilize demand, we have to work within their communities to have them say, their religious leaders, their women's groups, and so forth, say, look, this is what's really going on here. And public-private collaboration can help with both sides of the classic social policy dilemma. They can help integrate different sources of supply, as in the case of the Bangalore case, And they can help mobilize the demand because they can bring people to the table who have credibility in local communities. Now, what are the challenges for leaders and managers here? I'm going to suggest a few things to you which are suggestive but not definitive, because I think this subject needs a lot more work. So first of all, let's face the fact that collaboration is not costless or riskless. Okay? Robert Wade once wrote something where he did a little piece on, it wasn't Robert Wade, another author did a piece on public management in developing countries, and he said, nothing is so useless as a consultant's report that calls for more collaboration and more integration. He said, in fact, I think that the reports are useful in adverse proportion to the number of times they use words like integrate and collaborate. Because it's so easy to say. Come and say, well, you know, guys should be collaborating more. And you say, fine, I don't have any more time. I'm already busy. Do you want another meeting? And so one wise person once said, it's easier to collaborate if there's a pot of money in the middle of the table. If there are resources that we can share, it's a lot easier than we say, would you please come to a meeting? I'd like to take 4 hours of your time to collaborate on something with me. Not going to happen. But there's also costs about identity. For example, nonprofits face the risk of selling out their mission. There's a book called Beyond the Silver Bullet, which is a treatment of public-private collaboration in the early days, where the World Bank was going out and using NGOs as the conduit for development aid instead of governments. And the NGO said, oh my God, World Bank. We're working with the World Bank. We have to fill out these forms. You have to have these quantitative measures. We're not quantitative people. We don't believe in quantitative. We believe in the heart. Patricia Carlevaro was right. It's passion, not a bunch of bean counting. And in fact, if we collaborate too much with the capitalist World Bank, we will be selling out to the first world. You've heard that before? So NGOs are worried about selling out, collaborating with government. Are we going to lose our objectivity? Are we going to not be able to be advocates anymore if we are partners? Governments are also worried. If they partner with the private sector and NGOs, what do they lose? They lose control. So you have actors out there that you're sharing discretion with them. You're allowing them to play a part and having discretion on the problem, which means there are risks now of bad behavior. And finally, for the private sector, they're worried about a sinkhole of time. Somebody said earlier the private sector is good at doing things quickly. Well, suddenly now they're working with governments and NGOs, which are not famous for doing things quickly. So private sector is worried about this too. And in the background, we have the risk of corruption. Have you seen this bill from India now? The no bribe bill? You're supposed to give this, when somebody asks you for a bribe, you're supposed to give them this bill. It says, sorry, here's my bribe. It's 0 rupees. And if you do not fold this note, please, and pass it on. And by the way, if you'd like, we can call up somebody and tell them that you want something more than this bribe. But corruption lurks in the background of public-private nonprofit partnerships. It's the wrong kind of collaboration, isn't it? But that's there. So we have to look to prevent it. And in fact, there are many partnerships around to prevent corruption. I can name one for you right now, which is the Ciudadanos al Día program in Peru, which gets information from citizens, uses business sector, and then provides report cards on government agencies, which provide checks on the ability of government agencies to be corrupt. There's an interesting volume called the Good Collaboration Toolkit. There's a project by Howard Gardner at Harvard, the famous author of the multiple intelligence thing, called the Good Project. You can look it up on the web, the Good Project. I like it. What's good work? What is a good organization? And they have one called What is Good Collaboration? They have something called the Good Collaboration Toolkit. And you know what it emphasizes to make collaboration work? It emphasizes relationships. Relationships across the boundary of private sector, NGO, government official. Are those natural friendships? Do they speak the same language? Do they have the same kind of training? Do they look the same? Are they the same ages? Sometimes they're very different. And so this toolkit has a whole bunch of exercises and tricks that aim to bring the people together and help them identify their motivations, goals, and values so that they can share that with each other, so people start to understand where you are coming from. Secondly, to engage with potential collaborators about whether it's a good idea to partner, whether we have enough in common, and then how to do so. Here's a basic rule there. Collaboration has to be incentive compatible, by which I mean it has to be good for each organization in the coin, metaphorically, with which that organization measures success. Okay? It has to be good for a business to make money. Otherwise, business will be there for a little while, it'll go away. It has to be good for the NGO in terms of its mission, whatever it sees that to be, or else it'll go away. Ditto for government. Finally, talk candidly and productively with current collaborators when confronted with roadblocks. They have a whole bunch of devices here. When we got a problem, so we don't just stop talking about it, but we bring it out in the open and share in a way that builds communication and trust. Finally, after a collaboration is over, they have some devices in this toolkit for figuring out what worked and what didn't work. And they're now tabulating some of those results to share with the rest of us. So have a look at the Good Collaboration Toolkit, and you can see some of the tricks there are for actually managing these things and making them work. Then there's a thing called backbone functions. With any partnership, there's a problem of inertia. Who's going to do the hard stuff? Who keeps the books? Who does the staffing, the communication, the convening? Who does all this stuff? And, I just as soon have you do it. I'll be part of the partner, but you guys do it. Okay? I'll be a free rider on your good ability. And so it's been argued recently that public-private nonprofit collaboration requires what they call a backbone function. Something that is designed to be there, almost like a full-time staff, that is not necessarily owned by any of the partners, and that provides some of these overhead functions, if you will, that are necessary for a good partnership. So again, if you're interested in this, you can look up on the internet, look up backbone functions, and you'll find some of the new articles which have this diagram in them, and some of the evidence about whether this is the way to go for a lasting and effective partnership. Here are some other challenges that leaders face with regard to public-private nonprofit partnerships. Communication across cultures. What I mean by cultures is organizational cultures. You have a different bottom line than I have. How do we talk to each other? I got a bunch of jargon you don't have. How do I talk to you? Can we learn each other's jargon? Can I, if I'm a leader of an organization, can I learn to speak with you and vice versa so that we can communicate effectively across with each other, but also down to the people that work for us and with us? Flows of information and incentives. If we have different metrics and different reporting systems, different IT systems, it's sometimes hard to compatibilize those. And so a big challenge, just as it is with corporate mergers, is how do we make those systems compatible with each other so that information and incentives are aligned? And then third, how do we put comparative advantage with tasks? So if we have a partnership, like the Indian Aadhaar program, the Universal ID program, where the head of this, Nilakani, literally put down the functions. Here's what we have to do. Here are the kinds of organizations that could be involved, and here's what they're really good at. And then he spent his first year traveling around the country, what he called a road show, describing the problems, trying to get all the different actors on board to make this remarkable public policy innovation and partnership happen. So now we go to challenges for universities, by which I mean this university, my university, and all areas of society that try to build knowledge and make a difference in the world with that knowledge. Think tanks, for example. What are the opportunities that this revolutionary movement toward public-private nonprofit collaboration involves? First of all, it involves changes to the way we do research. Partnerships and collaboration are themes that cut across policy areas: health, education, water, and yet we don't have enough integration of our concepts across those fields, a little bit of a language problem there too, to compare what kinds of devices, what kinds of leadership and management makes the most difference in different kinds of partnerships, what technical conditions interact with what choices about the way we design and manage partnerships. And our partnerships, I'm arguing, demand different kinds of skills or additional skills in leadership and management that go beyond the courses we usually teach about how to manage an agency or how to lead a company or how to manage an IT department. Those are different skills, they're still valuable, but now we've got some new skills, and are we teaching those? I don't think we are. My university is just starting to teach these. Partnerships in research. Now think about the area you do research in, or that you read research in, okay? Think about that area. And imagine we're trying to design a study that's truly valid, has the right kind of information, analyzed in the right way, and then that truly has an impact, that is disseminated to the right people in the right formats. Imagine that. And now, how can we imagine doing that even better than we do now? And one argument is partnerships. Partnerships, for example, if we're doing studies on poverty, partnerships with the poor. If we're doing studies on drug abuse, with those who are using drugs. If we're doing things about communicable diseases, let's talk to the doctors and nurses and patients on the ground. Why? Because they can help us figure out what information analysis people really need. Not just some ideal government official or some journal, but what does a public-private partnership need? What do patients need? What do service providers need? They can help us design a study, particularly things like getting better information, getting data. Studies of the homeless had better have homeless people helping you collect the data, or you're not going to find the homeless. Ditto for HIV, AIDS, and a lot of other issues where there's stigma involved. Illegal immigration. And interpreting the results. I get the statistics back. I've got chi-squareds. I've got R-squareds. I've got partial regression coefficients. And I've got a journal article. Wow. But what's it mean? Not only what does it mean if I turn this dial, but what's it mean in practice? I'm showing you results. It seems this is true. Does that make sense to you? Oh, that's only true if these conditions are met. In my experience, that's not true over here. So now I do a better piece of research. I try out a new idea that I've gotten from the users and practitioners. And then once I have the study, so what? What's it mean for action? What are its implications? And here's the most exciting idea. When we get policymakers together to consider research with us, they have better ideas than we ever could think of about the applicability of the results to real choices that have to be made. And finally, dissemination of results. Not just journal articles, not just formal reports to the minister, but in the case of rural health, for example, through theater programs that take the message out to people, through village marketing programs where you get into the marketplaces and show people right now about the danger of bushmeat, for example, with regard to Ebola. Then there's a thing called the solution ecosystem, and a remarkable book called The Solution Revolution came out about 11 months ago by two professors and two researchers, and published by Harvard Business School Press. And they suggest for a whole range of problems, here's the hierarchy of things we need to do. First, what are the problems right now? What are the limits and failures in our current solutions and players? Second, if we had that central problem, how could we get it into the spotlight? How could we think about relevant technologies, maybe from out-of-the-box places, to apply to this problem? Let's be brainstorming. Third, how do we invest in activities that could show a new way of doing things, like that program in San Antonio? And then finally, how do we get this up to a scale, which is where San Antonio failed? A few things that Coca-Cola did, but we don't have a program to get this up to scale to solve the problem. Now, convening is a term I used, and you probably heard me talk about this before already during my visit here. I think we've got to move from the report for the decision maker, for the decision, to convening people from multiple sectors, public, private, and nonprofit, multiple agencies if that's what the problem demands, to think about what the data are so they can see where their problem is. They can look at examples of success on similar issues in other places, and they can get the best we have in terms of social science knowledge, principles, theories, models, and so forth. And by taking those three things to people in a safe place, meaning off the telephones, out of the press, where they can be frank with each other, and you stimulate them to suddenly go, okay, I never thought of that. How could we make that work? And have a dialogue that you and I would never have thought of. And what that can do is yield new practical ideas and foster new partnerships. One more slide to go. Okay. What does this all mean? The big picture. if we take this trend seriously, that for many major issues facing our society, from immigration to national security, from disease outbreaks to education, from public health to public safety, even things like transportation, even things like water, city services, if we say that, you know what, we need much more collaboration between business, government, and civil society to address these issues, what does that mean for the way we do business? I believe it changes what we mean by public policy. We study public policy in America as what government does, not what partnerships can do. We study leadership by what the mayor or the president or the governor is like. Charismatic, effective, big vision, right? Cares about the right things. That's important. But now leadership means something else. How do I mobilize and integrate supply? How do I mobilize demand? How do I use multiple people to make something happen, not just my orders? It's a whole different set of skills and policies. So public policy, leadership, and management may be changing what we mean by that in important ways. And secondly, universities and people like us have some special opportunities right now. We have a chance to do research partnership with public and private, especially the people involved in the problems we're studying, to improve the quality of the research academically and its practical impact. I think that's a huge area for us to work on. It's not natural for us as university people, but it's a huge area. And when we see a few examples of this, we go, okay, I get it. Let's see if we can do that. And then we got to find funding for it. And secondly, I'm very excited, as you can tell, about convening partners. Not to talk about problems and have a little tea group session or a pleasant conversation. What do you think about that? But to convene them with research, with data, with case studies, and with the best principles we can provide about what works where. Let me stop now and see what you think. Thank you very much.
Well, first off, I have to say that was really quite a comprehensive and wide-ranging lecture, Bob. Thank you so much for that. Second thing I should say is that, what you presented also, and especially the last slide, really challenges our conventional views of, as you say, public policy, public management, public leadership. Coming from a place like Singapore, and I've served in the Singapore government, it really challenges the way we conceive of what governments should do. And when you talked a lot about, in the context of public, private, and non-profit partnerships, and I take the point that when different parties have different and distinctive advantages, it makes sense to marry them, to collaborate, to integrate, as you call it, to integrate supply. But what happens if you come across a government that is technically very competent, well-resourced, it's not short of funding, it's not short of ideas, it is high execution capabilities, it believes in its...
You mean Bangladesh?
No. Yes, perhaps Bangladesh, yeah. Here's this incredibly competent elite government, right? I wonder where, is there some intrinsic value in PPNPs, right? Public-private, non-profit partnerships that even if governments doing it alone might do a good job. We say, well, let's give PPNPs, more careful consideration. Let's see whether that delivers some civic benefits as opposed to just policy benefits. Even if those PPNPs take longer to gestate, take longer to execute, are there some intrinsic social values or political values that we want, benefits that we want with PPNPs, over and above assessing it in terms of the usual cost-benefit analysis that policymakers use?
That's a little different question. I thought you were asking me a slightly easier question than that. So first of all, let's point out that Singapore has a lot of public-private partnerships now. There are studies done by some of our colleagues here of public-private partnerships in health in Singapore. You may have noticed that the woman who's now in charge of improving city services, that new role where she's not going to integrate everybody, but she's going to integrate, has also talked about integrating with the public. That is a public-government partnership, citizen partnership with government. And I believe that will turn out to be something more than just getting a bunch of ideas that could end up with some shared discretion where I try to give civic groups a chance to solve their own problems with my money and with their effort. So we could see some areas in the areas that are most troubling to you, such as housing, Social Security / old age care, maybe even immigration, and the immigration issue of integrating immigrants and so forth, as we have in my country. Those are all issues where we don't have a good solution yet from government alone, and where we might want to try some innovation, which you already see happening here. But if you ask, is there what you didn't ask, is there a corresponding cost and risk to this? Absolutely is. So I am not the person saying the solution to every problem is integration or collaboration, not at all. I'm saying there are benefits, which on some problems, we got to do it. You know, the MDR TB, I don't think there's any way for a government to do that by itself, no way. We're going to have collaboration, but we have to go into it with our eyes very sharp. What are the risks? What are the reputational risks? What are the cost risks? Where are the ways this can go wrong? And I guess my argument is there are some big design risks, but if we have the right kind of leaders and managers of this thing, I think it has a lot better chance of succeeding than if we just go and assume this is just like any other problem in public policy.
Right.
Tony.
It will be.
Some of my colleagues have been evolving this new concept of the public value, or the new public governance, which is really PPPs with the 3 Ps, and not just public and private, but also the people sector. And whether you need a sort of a tripartite structure with a level playing field for all 3 parties. Because what happens if big government colludes with big industry, and then you have a lot of market failures, right? So where are the checks and balances? So I would like to throw the 3 Ps into the other realm, not just getting the partnerships and all that, but the check and balance on one of the Ps that it's overwhelming, whether it's profit driven or it keeps people out. So for example, here, it's the privatization projects, right? When bureaucrats and business leaders see it to their advantage to privatize, and then who really benefits from that? Other transboundary problems like the haze, for example, where big business and government in certain countries, where there's inefficiency or corruption and all that colludes. So where is the check on this? Will be civil society. What else do you have? So that when the market fails, we need the 3rd P to be just as strong as the other 2 Ps. So whether this holy trinity is the way to go?
Yes. So that's a great question. You may remember a slide in there I put about corruption risk from public-private partnerships, and the next slide said, maybe somewhat paradoxically, one of the solutions to that risk is, again, public-private nonprofit partnerships, but involving a lot more of the civil society feedback. And I had 5 examples I didn't want to go through because this lecture is long enough already, and perhaps another lecture I can talk about that. There's an article I wrote last year and a half ago, about public-private collaboration against corruption, which has exciting examples around the world trying to prevent what might be called the wrong kind of privatization of the state, where big labor, big government, big organized crime get together with big business and leave the rest of us out, right? So what do we do about that risk? And I guess I don't want to be too cute about it, but I think public-private nonprofit collaboration is also a headline in dealing with that risk of public-private nonprofit collaboration. So I'll leave that paradox for those of you who like yin and yang. You can sort of worry about that tonight as you go to sleep.
But thank you very much for that presentation, Professor Klitgaard. It was quite a lot of material you covered there. My name's Evan Town. I'm a research assistant with the Asia Competitiveness Institute here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So it's actually, I want to build on the first question as well as what you mentioned about the solution ecosystem. That notion I find quite intriguing, and I hope you can build on it for this question I have about that trinity of public, private, and the civil society. Because in the sense of when I look at the term public-private partnerships, my understanding has mostly been of it being very much based upon a specific nation's interest when we talk about public. But what happens when we talk about transnational interests, when we talk about a region, for example, ASEAN? So how would we build a public-private partnership that is multi-publics? Or how would we say that, is it from the senior decision maker level? Should all the senior management of the various countries get together to form a notion of a common public? Or should it be built up from a civil society that all the different people feel that, yes, we are actually one, people with very common interests. And so how would this dynamic interact? I would like to pick your brain on this notion.
Well, let's begin by saying that we have many examples of regional public goods. The Mekong River, Development Association is an example. ASEAN itself is an example. There are many subunits of ASEAN which deal with particular problems. And the question which you're asking could be rephrased this way. Given that we have these organizations basically built around governments, how might they incorporate private sector and civil society organizations to make their missions even more effective? Okay, so the Mekong River is a good example because there are all sorts of private users and citizen users of that river who are affected by government choices, right? So in terms of thinking about the big challenges for managing the river, upstream, downstream, information about use and pollution, possible identification of high demand opportunities for the future, and so forth, managing the common pool resources at the local level. All those things could be done by government, but could be done perhaps arguably much more effectively with some sort of public-private nonprofit partnership. Other examples in water are abundant with big lakes where there's many countries using the same area. It's been argued that water will be a source of conflict, international conflict over the next 10 years, perhaps the source of international conflict. So we better get on this with more than just government agencies at stake. Another big example is international development itself, thinking about what the World Bank's mission is and how it positions itself. It was James Wolfenson who talked about the partnership revolution, but almost every international aid agency now, if you look at its rhetoric, website of ADB, Ford Foundation, USAID, whatever, they're going to be talking about public-private nonprofit collaboration and how to make it work. What hasn't been clear to me is that they go beyond the rhetoric of that and do more than try to co-opt people into what they call buy-in. I'll listen to you so you buy into my idea. You know, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about effective examples of things where you provide what you're good at, you provide what you're good at, I provide what little bit I'm good at. We try to focus on common metrics, common goals, and we try to push things forward with everybody's help. And it's there where I think universities are likely to make the big contributions rather than aid agencies, because we can help them think about outstanding examples of success and failure, and then what are the lessons we can draw from those for leadership and management.
So.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Vishal Kapoor. I'm a student of MPA at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Thank you very much for the enlightening presentation. I had a question in regard to the implementation of the public-private partnerships. More often than not, public-private partnerships, as opposed to pure privatization, they involve a lot of the responsibility and accountability even from the government counterpart. Now, with the kind of risk that is associated with projects, as opposed to a privatization initiative, in a public-private partnership, when the implementation starts and when we find that the estimates or maybe the demand forecast, things that actually were planned earlier, they did not go the right way. During the course of implementation, if the public-private partnership alters the course, then it is open to kind of, you can say, vitiation of the selection criteria of the private partner.
Yes.
Now, how do we deal with such situations? Because as opposed to a private initiative, I mean, you just privatize and then it's the responsibility of the private. But when both the things, when both parties are equally responsible, how things should be carried out? What are your views on that? Because in India, we have seen quite a few initiatives, PPP initiatives, go completely down the track because of this.
Well, what we're talking about here is the classic PPP of infrastructure, roadways, electric grids, water systems, and so forth. What I've been talking about in this talk has been sort of what you might call second or third generation PPPs, education, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, even the whole way you run your city. Right? So a little different. The area you're talking about, however, still is alive and well, especially in Europe and developing countries, less so in my country as it happens. I don't know why that's the case, but it's sort of stagnant in my country in terms of infrastructure PPPs. And here's a common problem. Common problem is after the award is made, there's a renegotiation within the first year that changes the terms of the award. So for example, Jose Luis Guasch, in an interesting study of infrastructure projects in Latin America by water, power, electricity, and so forth, estimated that in the first year after a new government came to power, 70% of public-private contracts were renegotiated. Now this time there's no competition and transparency, it's all you and me. Yeah. So it's a tremendous source of corruption. Just so we don't think it's Latin America, studies in Europe, there's a very good center on public-private partnerships at Copenhagen University at the business school, and they have studies there of infrastructure projects all over Eastern and Central Europe. Tremendous amounts of potential corruption in this renegotiation process. So it's a grave issue. So now what do we think about that? How do we handle that problem? We have to get more transparency about the costs. So for example, the Saudis once were going to build a port, and they had competition among all these companies to build the port, but they were worried they were going to get cheated anyway through collusion and so forth. So they hired the Rand Corporation, an independent think tank, to do its own study of what the cost would be for a port. So they had an independent study which they did not reveal to the contractors. I got my own information here, which that may help. So benchmarking across countries, how much does it cost to build a kilometer of road? What's it cost to build a dam in these kinds of conditions? Never get it perfect, but by sharing the information about relative costs, timing, and quality levels, you can get some more transparency, and then of course special studies that you can do to try to help clarify what that renegotiated price really was, and is that worthwhile. But we've located a problem. The problem is when we get public and private and nonprofit together, we have temptations for corruption and collusion. Okay? So there's a power problem, and therefore we've got to take even more steps to provide more transparency in that problem. And as I was arguing in my yin and yang solution, that often can involve public-private partnerships of a new kind, which you might call transparency initiatives that build from the bottom up. I'll leave that as a topic for our next conversation.
There's time for one more question. Rajiv?
My name is Rajiv Deshpande. I'm on the Master of Public Management program at the LKY School. Just wanted your thoughts on amongst the types of PPP that you mentioned. It's another one, an example that I just wanted to bring to your attention, where the private entity is an NGO. This is a small example from a suburb on the outskirts of Delhi, which is also an IT hub. It's called Gurgaon, where an area that was wasted by mining is being sort of redeveloped, where the partnership is between the municipal authority and an NGO. And some of the money comes from the government, but much of it has been raised by the NGO through corporate funding. So the NGO is doing the work of raising finance to develop the site, and it's also running the project. Now, this sort of a partnership where the NGO is not the majority stakeholder, the control remains with the government, but its executive functions are clearly more important, and where it's sort of marketing the project as such, and perhaps doing a better job of it than if it had been left to just the government agency to do it. So it's in some ways overcoming or taking care of some of the traditional shortcomings of the government in executing a project or marketing it, and it's a partner with the government. This kind of a thing, and it also taps into what is the corporate social responsibility functions of corporates. Corporates have to set aside some budget for these kind of projects, so it's trying to bring them. Do you think there's a future in this kind of a model? Is that, or there is they could sort of at some point of time, be a conflict between the government side of it and the NGO side of it, in your experience?
Yeah. Well, it's a very complicated question the way you asked it, because I don't know about the specifics of the case you're talking about, so let me comment generally. There's an interesting book by Donahue and Zeckhauser called Collaborative Governance, which has a lot of the experience in America with these relationships. And they have a statement in there which is interesting. It says, collaborative governance can lead to great success or disastrous failure. Okay? So this is not a panacea. It depends on how it's designed, how it's managed, and how it's found accountable. So the hardcore questions we're talking about of design, leadership, and management turn out to be vital for the success of what looks like a perfect public-private nonprofit complementarity. That may be a necessary condition to see these comparative advantages, but it's not sufficient. We need to go further with the monitoring, the rewarding, the communication across the partners, and all the things we talked about in very general terms here. So you can see why this is a subject that we're not exhausting today. What I've done is invited you to think about this perhaps in new ways. It's an old subject. We've had public-private partnerships for decades, maybe even longer. There's some back in the 1800s. So it's not a new subject, but I think with the communications revolution, with the importance of popular participation that's not just through the ballot box growing, with the idea of creating shared value replacing corporate social responsibility, companies looking for ways to do things that are good for their bottom line and good for their communities, that this general set of challenges and opportunities will grow, and it's up to us to design the best kind of research and the best kind of teaching so that we play our part in making even better public-private partnerships in the future.
This one is more the consultant point of view. I'm part of Eden Strategy Institute, and we are in consulting with a social innovation angle. To make it short, or when you have partnerships, you have all the actors aligned, they all agree on everything, you have a business case. How do you speed up the process? How do we get a champion to emerge and say, okay, I'm going to drive it? Because sometimes they have the view, okay, it's great, everything is here, we have identified the benefit for everyone, but oh, you know, in the next 6 months we have this one going on, oh, no, it's not the right time, oh, the new CEO came in, oh. So how do you speed things up?
Yeah. Well, there's no general answer to that. What you're saying is in the real world, all kinds of things get in the way, don't they? I like this idea of the backbone organization. This appears in the Stanford Innovation Review about 2 years ago. So take a look at the Stanford Innovation Review and look up backbone organization, and you'll see that it tries to solve the problem of no one person wants to take charge, either for humility or for the fact it's a big cost, right? So if they get together and say, you know, other people have done this, they set up this backbone unit, and it will cost this much. How about if we do that? Everybody goes, okay, let's do that, and figure out who should be in that unit. Because maybe no one wants to be the champion because they're afraid it's too much cost and too much responsibility. Sorry, I can't answer your question any more specifically than that.
Right. I think the real takeaway from this lecture has been the big picture that you painted at the end of it, and how that demands a different approach to public policy. And the specifics may vary, but it really has quite revolutionary implications for the way we teach public policy and public management and leadership, and the way governments conduct business, provide public services, convene people, get things moving. I think that's the real big implication for governments. On that note, I want to thank everybody for their patience, for staying till the end and for asking such a wide range of questions. And of course also Professor Bob Klitgaard for giving us such a dazzling presentation and plenty of examples and insights from across the world. Please join me in thanking him in the usual way.
Thank you very much.